Hello students, welcome to the second lecture on the issue of terrorism. In the first lecture we discussed the definitional problem of terrorism, then we discussed the 5 core elements of terrorism, and then we discussed the various strategies used by the terrorists for achieving their political objectives and various strategies used by the terrorists in perpetrating their terrorist acts. In this lecture, we will discuss various approaches to understand the issue of terrorism, particularly focusing on 3 theories of international relations. They are the realism, liberalism and the critical perspectives. Then we will focus on different counter-terrorism measures used by different countries to deal with the problem of terrorism. And finally, we will discuss the post 9/11 developments, how the Al-Qaeda attacked the United States, the most powerful country on the earth, on its own soil, and how that led the United States to think and act on the issue of terrorism very differently than before 9/11. So, let us now discuss on various approaches to understand the issue of terrorism. First, we will start with the theory of realism. The realist thinking about terrorism tends to place a strong emphasis on the state and non-state actor dichotomy. So, let me clarify it right from the beginning that the realists refuse to accept that the state could engage in terrorist activities. Rather, they believe that terrorism is an act perpetrated by the non-state actors only. Terrorism is usually viewed as a violent challenge to the established order by a non-state group or a movement, often as a bid to capture state power. So, terrorist organizations are there and they have a political objective, and that political objective is to capture power. That is the strong perception of the realist theory. The realist emphasis on politics as an arena of power struggle can thus be seen to apply to the behavior of non-state actors like that of the state. So, according to the realist, if we accept that politics is a struggle for power, so both the states and non-state actors, they compete against each other to capture power, and that is how the political objective of the terrorist and the state actors are not different from each other. From this perspective, the motivation behind terrorism are largely strategic, or what we can call as political purpose. Terrorist groups use clandestine violence and focus on civilian targets mainly because they are too weak to challenge the state openly through conventional armed conflict. They attempt to exhaust or weaken the resolve of a government or a regime that they cannot destroy openly. So, that is their objective, that they cannot directly engage with the state through violent methods because the state is a powerful actor. So, what they do is they target the civilians, the non-combatants, because that is the way they can bleed the state, they can bleed the government and exhaust its power. The crucial feature of the realist approach to terrorism is nevertheless that being an attempt to subvert civil order and overthrow the political system, the state's response to terrorism should be matching and uncompromising. Because the terrorists are hell bent on subverting the civil order or overthrow the political system, so the state should not make a distinction between moral objectives and political objectives. Rather, the state should deal with the problem of terrorism in a ruthless manner, and particularly the state response to deal with the terrorists should be matching and uncompromising. This implies that political leaders should be prepared to disregard conventional morality in order to protect a threatened political community. So, the realists advise the politicians and the state leaders that even if there is a need to disregard the conventional morality, they should not bother about that, because their objective is to protect the political community, the people of the state. So, that is their morality. So, they should not think about human rights, they should not think about individual kind of morality. Rather, whatever is needed, whatever coercive instruments they have at their disposal, so they should use it to combat the terrorism or to deal with the problem of terrorism. As we have already discussed that the realist theory make a distinction between individual morality and state morality, and here the state morality is to protect its citizens, to protect its population, and for that whatever coercive instruments they have, they should use that against the terrorists, because the terrorists want to overthrow the government or destroy the state. The realists are therefore unconcerned about whether counter-terrorism strategies infringe civil liberties or not. Their important objective is to ensure that the counter-terrorism policy actually works. So, unlike the liberals, they are not interested for civil liberties, freedom, individual rights. Rather, they think that the only strategy should be the survival of the state, the security of the state, and for that whatever is needed, whatever is justifiable, that should be used against the terrorist. Now, let us discuss about the liberal perspectives on terrorism. The liberals, like the realists, tend to view terrorism as an activity primarily engaged in by the non-state actors. So, like the realists, the liberals have this common perception that they associate terrorism with non-state actors, but they have a different view about the motivations behind terrorism, as they emphasize the role of ideology rather than simple power seeking behavior of the terrorists. So, unlike the realists who emphasize the power seeking behavior of the terrorists, the liberals think that their real motivation is ideology rather than power. A key factor in explaining terrorism is therefore the influence of a political or religious ideology that creates an exaggerated sense of injustice and hostility, and so binds the perpetrators of violence to the moral and human cost of their actions. So, here ideology is used to magnify the sense of their injustice and hostility that they may have suffered by any kind of state action, and that also act as a glue to bind different types of people who are unified for a single objective of acting against the state or government. However, the liberal thinking about terrorism has been dominated by the ethical dilemmas that are posed by the counter-terrorism measures. On the one hand, the liberals typically view terrorism as an attack on the very principles of a liberal democratic society, that is the openness, the choice, debate, toleration, and so on. So, these are the liberal values for which the liberalism stands for. On the other hand, the liberals are worried to ensure that their attempts to counter terrorism are consistent with the same liberal values, and in particular they should not infringe human rights and civil liberties. So, the problem with liberal democracy is that you want to respect the liberal democratic values, but whenever you think of any counter terrorism action, or if you think of any counter terrorism measure, in a way you erode those values, you create problems for those values, and that is the kind of ethical dilemma the liberalism is confronted with. The third perspective on the issue of terrorism is the critical perspective. There are two main critical perspectives on the issue of terrorism. The first is called the radical theorist like Noam Chomsky, for whom terrorism amounts to the killing of unarmed civilians. So, this is the criteria on the basis of which Chomsky makes no distinction between the state actors and non-state actors on the issue of terrorism. It is an activity that is engaged in by both the states and non-state actors. State terrorism, which he calls the wholesale terrorism, indeed is much more significant and important than non-state terrorism, or what he calls retail terrorism, because the states have a far greater coercive capacity than any non-state actors. So, because the states are the most serious and most important coercive instruments of power and violence, so on that basis the state actors may be differentiated from non-state actors, because they are not as powerful as the state actors. Terrorism is thus largely a mechanism through which states use violence against the civilians, either to maintain themselves in power or to extend political or economic influence over other states. So, terrorism has two political objectives as far as the states are concerned, either to use violence against the civilians to maintain themselves in power or to extend political or economic influence over other countries. In this respect, particular attention has been focused on the role of violence in promoting US hegemony, and in that sense, USA can be viewed as the world's leading terrorist state. So, whatever violent methods the United States has been using against other countries or non-state actors, so that is to maintain its preeminent position in international politics, and for that objective it can use violent or coercive methods against the other state actors and even non-state actors. The alternative critical perspective on terrorism is shaped largely by the constructivist and the post-structuralist thinking. It is characterized by the belief that much commonly accepted knowledge about terrorism amounts to stereotypes and even misconceptions. In this view, terrorism is a social or political construct typically used to define certain groups and political causes as non-legitimate by associating them with the image of immorality and wanton violence. So, the basic argument is you define some people or some groups in a way that stigmatize them or that delegitimize their political methods, or you consider them as violent because that is immoral and they are engaged in wanton kind of violence. So, their basic argument is how you define terrorism is basically a social or political construct, and this is defined in a way that delegitimize the activities and actions of certain groups because you consider them as immoral and you consider them as violent. This in turn tends to imply that the institutions and political structures against which terrorism is used are rightful and legitimate. So, when you delegitimize the political actions or the activities of certain people, so in a way you legitimize your own action, and that is the whole kind of politics or political discourse. Such thinking has been applied in particular to the discourses that have emerged in connection with the war on terror, in which the term terrorism is allegedly used to delegitimize the image of the dominant actors in the international system. So, if you look at the 9/11 terrorist attack against the United States, so the foreign policy of the United States is basically based on this perception that once you consider the other actor as illegitimate, immoral, then you justify your own activities, you justify your own actions, and this justification is basically given to the state actors, those who are powerful actors, those who are powerful entities in the international politics. So, if you look at the whole discourse on terrorism after 9/11, you will find that some state actors' actions are considered as something legitimate, something moral, and other state activities or other activities by the non-state actors, they were considered as illegitimate and immoral, and this is how the whole discourse of terrorism, the whole understanding of terrorism has changed, that we will discuss in a separate slide. Now, let us discuss about various counter-terrorism methods used by different countries all over the world. Terrorism poses difficult challenges to established societies. Unlike other military threats, terrorists often do not have a conventional base or location, and they may be particularly difficult to distinguish from a civilian population at large, because it is very difficult to distinguish who are the terrorists and who are the civilians. So, it is very difficult to deal with the problem of terrorism. Furthermore, it is notoriously difficult to protect against or prevent kidnappings, armed attacks, vehicle bombs and suicide attacks. So, because these are the popular methods used by the terrorists, so it is very difficult to prevent them, and it is also very difficult to deal with the problem of terrorism. So, then the question is how terrorism can be really countered. So, if you look at the different kind of counter-terrorism methods used by the different states in international politics, we will conclude these are some of the most popular methods to deal with the problem of terrorism. The first is strengthening the state security. In states such as India, Israel, Sri Lanka, Spain and the United Kingdom, which have experienced long campaigns of nationalist based terrorism, tighter state security often based on emergency legislation is used as a kind of method to deal with the problem of terrorism. For instance, India has formulated a draconian law called Unlawful Activities Prevention Act to deal with the problem of terrorism. However, this approach has at least two key drawbacks. First, they endanger the very liberal democratic freedoms that we have discussed during the liberal approach to terrorism that they attempt to defend by combating terrorism. And we have discussed this ethical dilemma during our discussion on the liberal approach to deal with the problem of terrorism. Second, such measures may be counterproductive insofar as they appear to target particular religious groups who in turn may support or possibly engage in terrorist activities. So, when you engage in counter-terrorism activities against a particular group or a religious group, you may create unintentionally a kind of situation when if anything unjust or anything wrong happens to those people, they may support or possibly engage in any kind of terrorist activities against the government or against the state. The second popular counter-terrorism method is what is called military repression. Force-based counter-terrorism is widely used by different countries to deal with the problem of terrorism. For instance, India's military actions in Punjab is cited as one of the reasons how military repression was used against a particular terrorist activity and that was ultimately successful. This military repression in Punjab had three dimensions. First, the military action was visible, second it was stark, and third it was unafraid, and what we now call a zero tolerance against terrorism. So, you take the stand that whatever may be the demand of the terrorist, you will not bow your head before them and you will deal with them through violence, through military approach or military repression. However, to wage a war on terrorist organization is to attack the manifestation of the problem rather than its underlying cause. So, military approach may be popular, but it is just the manifestation of the problem, it is not the cause of the problem, or we should have to go to the root of the problem if we want to deal with the problem of terrorism. There are also collateral casualties and controversies about their human rights impact. So, if force is used, so there is no restriction, sometimes force may be used against innocents and there are collateral damages. So, when violent state methods are used, you have collateral damages and also there may be serious violation of your own laws or serious violation of human rights. So, this method is not free from criticism and we can call it as a limitation of military repression approach. The third is the political deals or compromises. Most terrorist campaigns have political endings over time as leading figures in terrorist movements tend to gravitate towards respectability and constitutional politics. Nevertheless, governments have also pursued strategies designed specifically to encourage terrorists to abandon political violence by drawing them into the process of negotiation and diplomacy. The best example is the Mizo Accord signed between the Union government and the Mizo National Front in 1986. Sometimes you find that there are problems by certain organizations, they use violent methods, but over the years they abandon the violent method, and the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO is also another example when they renounce violent method and entered into negotiation with Israel. So, most of the time you will find that if the terrorist organization has a popular base, ultimately they leave violent method, they renounce violent method and indulge in negotiations, come to the negotiating table and reach into a political settlement. However, some see it as an example of appeasement or a moral retreat in the face of intimidation and violence. Moreover, political approaches are more likely to be effective in case of nationalist terrorism, where deals can be done over matters such as power sharing or political autonomy. So, the constitutional method or the political dialogue method has its own limitations, because if the terrorists are not motivated by any kind of power sharing or autonomy, and they are inspired by some religious objectives or heavenly objectives, so in that case it is very difficult to use dialogue or debate as a method to deal with the problem of terrorism. The next popular method used for countering terrorism is the social and economic development policies used to prevent a resurgence of terrorism, which has potential benefits and also shortcomings. India's developmental initiatives in the northeast, the Naxalite affected regions, and even Kashmir, they are the best examples of social and economic development policies, but they have the limitation that if the constitutional machinery does not function there, if the administrative setup does not function effectively there, then there is no guarantee that the developmental money or the economic packages that will reach to the intended beneficiaries. Sometimes it is looted by the middlemen, it is looted by the political leaders, sometimes it also is pocketed by the terrorists, because they have the nexus with the politician, with the businessman in that affected region. And that is how the money allocated for social and economic development that do not reach to the intended beneficiaries. And the last popular method used for countering terrorism, especially for global terrorism, is called diplomatic isolation. As terrorism has now acquired an international character, it is important to diplomatically isolate the countries that use cross-border terrorism as a low-cost foreign policy option against their neighbors and rival countries. India's diplomatic isolation of Pakistan in bilateral, multilateral and even international forums by naming Islamabad as the epicenter of international terrorism can be cited as the best example of diplomatic isolation. However, all these methods are not mutually exclusive. They should be used to complement and supplement each other. For example, you cannot depend exclusively on military force, or you cannot exclusively depend on economic development. So they should go in tandem, they should go with each other, and in that way you can better deal with the problem of terrorism. But as I said, we should make a distinction between domestic terrorism and international terrorism, because domestic terrorism requires different kind of measures and international terrorism requires different kinds of measures, and this will be clear when we discuss the post 9/11 developments. Widely considered as the most deadly act of international terrorism, the 9/11 attacks on the United States killed almost 3,000 people, injured another 25,000 people, and inspired attacks in Bali, London, Madrid and elsewhere. So, this kind of terrorist activity, it was most devastating in the sense the 9/11 event was not just another terrorist act in any part of the world, rather it affected the most powerful country in the world, and it not only did extensive damage to the United States in terms of its identity, in terms of its prestige, rather it changed the whole perception of terrorism, the whole understanding of terrorism by the United States. The horror of 9/11 stimulated US counter-terrorism response in 4 different waves. First, the US led coalition in Afghanistan dismantled the Taliban and Al-Qaeda infrastructure and killed its top leadership, including Osama bin Laden in 2011. So, and it is widely believed that both the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda, they are closely related to each other, and in fact Taliban had given asylum to Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, and it is also widely believed that the Al-Qaeda masterminded World Trade Center terrorist attack against the United States on September 9, 2001. Second, the US invaded Iraq in March 2003, leading to a civil war and facilitating the rise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the self-proclaimed Islamic State across Iraq and Syria, whose ideology and operational entities present a formidable threat to international peace and security. These two events one in Iraq and the other in Afghanistan, had a deeply destabilizing impact on the Middle East and the North African region and sparked a strong wave of anti-Americanism across the MENA. Third, the USA established a dedicated Department of Homeland Security that brought its domestic intelligence and law enforcement agencies under one umbrella. So, that is another development of 9/11 events. Fourth, the United States spearheaded global counter-terrorism programs by offering training and supporting governments that needed capabilities to fight their domestic and regional threats, networks and cells. So, the 9/11 terrorist attack not only led to the domestic reformulation of certain USA policies, rather it also strongly influenced its foreign policy towards the other countries and other regions, particularly the Middle East and the North African region. More than 2 decades since 9/11, international human rights system has been abused and weakened as the war on terror has blurred the lines of war, terror and human rights. So, the distinction which earlier existed between war, terror and human rights, that in a way was removed due to the post 9/11 response of the United States. The United States not only co-opted allies in illegal actions such as using their territory for extraordinary execution, but also further brutalized authoritarian regimes by pushing new counter-terrorism legislation, handing over suspects caught in Afghanistan, Iraq and Pakistan and allowing arbitrary detentions and enforced disappearances, eroding the standing and credibility of the West as the champion of democracy and human rights. So, once you engage yourself in extraordinary execution or you force these authoritarian countries to hand over the suspects and you execute them in a secret way, that in a way undermines your credibility as a champion of democracy and human rights. Another major impact is the societal effects of the war on terror. A sense of permanent insecurity, widespread surveillance, physical fortification of borders, Islamophobia and other kinds of xenophobia have resulted in the proliferation of conspiracy theories and general decay of trust in politics and experts. Not just a sense of permanent insecurity prevailed in the United States alone, rather that kind of insecurity was also felt in many different parts of the world. There was a long physical check in the airports, there was check in the public places and there was anti-Americanism, there was xenophobia, there was hatred against a particular kind of people or a particular kind of religion. So, this kind of insecurity prevailed all parts of the world due to the 9/11 developments. Another major impact of the 9/11 terrorist attack against the United States is the increasing use of drone technology, which escalated particularly during the Afghanistan conflict, and also the attendant controversies about the rules of engagement and civilian casualties. When you use drone against suspected militants or terrorists, the drone does not make any distinction between the civilians and the non-civilians or the combatants and the non-combatants. So, there was a huge collateral damage and there was also a huge controversy whether you can enter into another sovereign country's territory because of suspected militant or terrorist activity. Although the United States led in drone innovation, it quickly entered the intelligence and military arsenals of many other countries and even by non-state actors. Another major impact of the terrorist attack against the United States was the emergence of what can be called as the new world of surveillance. Increasing threat of online radicalization has also led to the growth of surveillance technology for intelligence and war fighting purposes. This has shifted targets from traditional state threats and their militaries to much more invisible terrorist network, revitalizing the debate about global governance, democratic rights, accountability and privacy. So, when you use widespread surveillance technology not only for your own citizens, but also the citizens of other countries, that generated a lot of debate about the effectiveness of global governance regimes, democratic rights, accountability and the privacy of individual citizens. So, this was a major development of the post 9/11 developments. The US and global responses to the 9/11 attacks have also resulted in significant changes in the interpretation of international law and state practices governing the use of force against terrorists and states sponsoring terrorism. Many governments now agree and also frequently use preemptive military strike and military force against the state and non-state actors and even terror suspects if the country sponsoring them is unwilling or unable to mitigate the threat. The United States under George W. Bush popularized this doctrine, and later on this preemptive military strike doctrine was used by Israel, Iran and India in different occasions. The last major post 9/11 development is the increasing multilateral cooperation on the issue of terrorism. The US supports and participates in international organizations such as NATO and Group of Seven and other platforms for coordination, cooperation and the development of common strategies to deal with the problem of terrorism. So, once there was a terrorist attack against the United States, its perception to terrorism, its understanding of terrorism, its understanding of others' problem of terrorism became widely evident, and the United States led a coalition of the willing to deal with the problem of terrorism in Afghanistan, and also it attacked Iraq, and the whole perception of the United States changed drastically after 9/11 developments. So, let us summarize what we have discussed so far. There are three main approaches to understand the problem of terrorism. The first is realism, the second is liberalism, and the third is critical perspectives, which help us to understand various dimensions of terrorism. Secondly, we discussed that states undertake various counter-terrorism strategies such as strengthening the state security, military approach, political dialogue and deals, social and economic development policies, and also diplomatic isolation. Thirdly, we also discussed how the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the United States led to a stronger American counter-terrorism response, which we can describe in four different waves. First, the war against terror in Afghanistan. Second, the invasion of Iraq. Third, the establishment of a separate Department of Homeland Security in the United States and strengthening of global counter-terrorism efforts. Other major consequences of the 9/11 terrorist attack against the United States included blurring the line between war, terror and human rights, permanent negative societal effects, the growth of surveillance technology, increasing use of drone technology, changes in the interpretation of international law and state practices on the use of force, and increasing multilateral cooperation in combating global terrorism. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patient hearing.